In August 1930-9, the Imperial Japanese Navy made an unusual decision, transferring their most brilliant admiral away from Tokyo. They sent Yamamoto Isoroku to sea to command the combined fleet, but the real reason was chilling. The army wanted to kill him. His only crime was speaking the truth, that Japan could not defeat the United States in a prolonged war. 2 years later, he would be forced to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, executing a strategy he himself had warned would fail. This was not a personal grudge, but an institutional hatred that had lasted nearly 80 years between two rival military services. From the moment of their birth, the Japanese Army and Navy were like two parallel lines racing in different directions without ever intersecting. Different foreign mentors, different imaginary enemies, and different imperial blueprints drove them further apart with each passing decade. By 1940-1, they were fighting two completely separate wars under the same flag and the same emperor, who could not veto either side. A nation capable of shocking the world was forced to sign written agreements between its own armed forces just to coordinate operations. Let us return to the very beginning, to 1860-8, when the last shogun surrendered and a 15-year-sold emperor ascended the throne. A nation sealed shut for 250 years suddenly looked up and found the world had left it far behind in every measure of power. Steam warships, rifled cannons, telegraph machines, an industrial military system capable of transporting 100,000 troops. Japan had none of this. They had only samurai, brave and skilled, yet utterly obsolete in the face of modern industrial warfare. The newly formed Meiji government decided Japan must build a modern military as fast as possible, never again letting foreign warships dominate its ports. To accomplish this, they apprenticed themselves to completely different countries. The army learned from France, and the navy learned from Britain. This seemingly pragmatic choice planted the seeds of every disaster that followed, as the two services developed incompatible doctrines from the very start. The French army was crushed in the Franco-Prussian War, and Japan's army promptly switched its allegiance to Germany and Prussian military philosophy. Prussian military philosophy emphasized defense, decisiveness, and decisive land battles, thinking that became deeply embedded in the Japanese Army's DNA. The Navy studied under the British Royal Navy, learning sea power theory, trade protection, and oceanic warfare, a completely different military mindset. Army officers studied Clausewitz, Weymann, Moltke in Berlin, while Navy officers studied Nelson and Mahon at Portsmouth, reading different books and planning different wars. In 1907, Japan formulated the Imperial National Defense Policy, writing both services' objectives into the same document yet pointing them in opposite directions. The Army's primary enemy was terrorist Russia, expanding northward to build continental depth, while the Navy's primary enemy was the United States, pushing southward for Pacific trade routes. One document, two enemies, two wars, no priority, and a fatal rule that either service could bring down the cabinet by withdrawing its minister. From this moment on, a time bomb was embedded in Japan's political system, and over the next 30 years the struggle between the two services spread to every corner. The budget was the most direct battlefield, as Japan was a resource mine, a Spur Island nation where every piece of steel and every drop of oil had to be carefully rationed. The Army wanted more divisions, the Navy wanted bigger battleships, and every budget review was a zero-sum game, where one service's gain was the other's loss. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1920- to only added fuel to the fire, as Japan was forced to accept capital shipped tonnage limits with a ratio of 5:3. The Navy considered this a profound humiliation by Western powers, while the Army quietly rejoiced that the Navy's budget was being compressed. Hatred fermented in silence, spread through barracks, and accumulated in every rejected shipbuilding plan over the following years. By the London Naval Conference of the 1930s, Hardliners within the Navy had reached their breaking point and the treaty cabinet fell under right-wing attacks. The Navy admiral who pushed for ratification even received death threats, showing how far the internal conflict had escalated within Japan's military establishment. Meanwhile, the Army's adventures in Manchuria were rewriting Japan's destiny as Kwantung Army officers faked a railway bombing to seize the entire Chinese province. Tokyo learned about it after the fact, as this army stationed in Manchuria operated independently as a state within a state, nominally under central command, but practically autonomous. The most shocking event occurred on February 20-6, 1930-6, when nearly 1,500 army soldiers poured into central Tokyo in a snowstorm targeting government officials. Within hours, they killed the finance minister, the former prime minister, and the inspector general of military education, shooting him in bed in front of his daughter. They tried to kill Prime Minister Okada, but mistakenly killed his brother in law, while Okada hid in a closet and survived the 3-day occupation of central Tokyo. The emperor personally condemned the rebellion, a rare intervention, and the coup collapsed, with its leaders tried in secret and executed. But the message had reached every corner: violence could change policy, and assassination could steer the nation in a new direction. The Navy watched with icy fear, not because they were pacifists, but because they had their own imperial ambitions requiring understanding of nations that already possessed empires. More Navy officers had trained in Britain and visited America, seeing firsthand what a fully industrialized economy could produce, understanding how quickly Japan's ambitions would collapse. Army hardliners saw this knowledge as weakness, even disloyalty, and after February 20-6, the civilian government entered permanent defensive posture. The rule requiring serving military officers as ministers was restored, meaning either service could overthrow the government at will, and usually the army was the one that acted. Threats against Navy officers who opposed war with the United States became increasingly specific, with addresses, schedules, and assassination timetables circulating. In August 1930-9, Navy Minister Yona, I made the quiet decision to transfer Yamamoto to sea command because Tokyo was no longer safe for Japan's most famous anti-war voice. Yamamoto understood perfectly, writing letters to friends in those months that seemed to be arrangements for his own death as he prepared to execute a strategy he had warned would fail. By October 1940-1, the debate was formally over, as Prime Minister Kono resigned after spending 3 terms trying to prevent war. The emperor appointed Tojo Hideki, a serving army general who simultaneously held the positions of War Minister and Prime Minister, as Japan's new leader. And did not go to war because its leadership reached consensus, but because one service finally silenced the other and forced the nation onto a path of no return. For decades, Japanese strategic thought had been dominated by 2 competing visions: strike north against the Soviet Union and strike south toward the oil fields of Southeast Asia. The Army's strike north vision meant attacking the Soviet Union from Manchuria in a 2-pronged assault alongside Germany, using the puppet state's 20-500-mile border as a springboard. The Navy's strike south vision meant seizing the oil of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber of Malaya, with the American-controlled Philippines sitting astride the sea lanes. Without oil, the fleet was scrap iron in port, and both visions had been on the table since 1907, with Japan postponing the choice for 30 years. By 1940, the moment of decision had arrived, and the Army moved first without permission, as the Kwantung Army escalated a border clash at No Mon Han into a full-scale war. For months, the conflict escalated continuously, until Japan's 6th Army of 70,000 men faced Zhukov, the commander who would become the most famous general of the war. On August 20th, 1930-9, Zhukov launched his offensive with synchronized combined arms assault, and within a week Japan's 6th Army disintegrated with 17,000 to 20,000 casualties. The Army's strike north fantasy evaporated in the dust of Mongolia and just 3 days later another blow fell as Germany and the Soviet Union signed an non-aggression pact. Japan had been Germany's anti-mine turned partner since 1930-6, built on the assumption that Berlin and Tokyo would face Moscow together. But in one afternoon, that assumption became a joke. Prime Minister Hiranuma's cabinet fell within days, and when he resigned, he left behind a phrase that would forever remain in Japan's historical memory about the complexity of the European situation. The army lost, but nobody won, as Strike North was dead and only Strike South remained, forcing the army to negotiate with a rival it had spent decades trying to outspend. Then Washington made the whole argument moot by imposing a de facto oil embargo after Japan moved into southern French Indochina, leaving Japan with only 18 months of strategic fuel reserves. Yamamoto gave his famous prediction: if ordered to fight, he would run wild for 6 months or a year, but had utterly no confidence for the second or third year of war. Yamamoto was not asked a second time, but was ordered to plan the attack. As Japan went to war because it had lost an argument with itself, it then ran out of time. December 7th, 1940-1, Sunday morning in Hawaii, 6 Japanese fleet carriers launched 350-3 aircraft at the Pacific Fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor. It was Yamamoto's plan, a Navy plan executed by Navy pilots flying Navy aircraft off Navy carriers, a strategy he had warned would buy only 6 months of advantage. The Army had been informed but was not enthusiastic, because while the Navy was crossing the Pacific, the Army was running its own war across Southeast Asia. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese infantry landed in British Malaya, invaded Hong Kong, attacked the American Philippines, and crossed into Thailand, each service running its own piece. This division reached its most tragic expression on Guadalcanal, where the Navy withdrew support and left the Army to starve in the jungle for 6 months. The Navy claimed the risk was too great, while the Army believed the Navy simply did not want to take casualties, as soldiers gnawed tree bark and disease ravaged their bodies. When supply ships did arrive, they could only dash in at night, drop a small amount of supplies, and flee, far from enough to sustain tens of thousands of men. In the end, 2-3 of the Japanese dead on Guadalcanal perished from starvation and disease, not American fire, and Japan never mounted another major strategic offensive. Guadalcanal was the turning point, where the Navy bled its irreplaceable carrier pilots, and the Army lost one of its finest divisions, and both services drew the same lesson: trust the other side even less. After Guadalcanal, you might expect reform and better coordination, but that is not what happened, as the strangest feature of this feud was that duplication got worse as Japan's situation deteriorated. As the fleet shrank, the Army built its own ships, and when aviation fuel became scarce, both services kept producing their own separate fighter lines, sometimes using the same engine series. When American submarines were wrangling Japanese shipping from every direction, the Army and Navy independently developed separate vessels rather than pooling their remaining resources. Every rational calculation said consolidate, but every institutional reflex said duplicate, as the Navy prioritized its own combat missions over escorting Army convoys it was technically obligated to protect. By 1940-3, the Army concluded it was done waiting and would build its own escorts, its own carriers, acquiring its own navy with ships like Aikitsu Maru and Yamashiyo Maru. The Army even had its own submarines, called Maru, built by locomotive factories because the Navy controlled all major shipyards, completing 30-8 out of a planned 400. To parallel defense systems with non-interchangeable parts, sometimes unable to share a radio frequency, ran side by side within one empire, while the United States outproduced them 10-1. In August 1940-5, the way the war ended perfectly encapsulated the nature of this feud, as Hiroshima was struck by an atomic bomb on August 6th. The Army General Staff's first reaction was to downplay the news, some dismissing it as allied propaganda, while only those who understood physics grasped what had actually happened. On August 9th, Nagasaki was struck by a second atomic bomb, and the same day 1.5 million Soviet troops poured across the border into Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army for 40 years, began to disintegrate within days under the Soviet assault. In Tokyo, army officers launched a coup to prevent the emperor's surrender recording from being broadcast, storming the imperial palace and searching for the recording discs. The coup failed, but Army Minister Rei Nami, who had opposed surrender in the Imperial Council but did not join the coup, chose seppuku that morning instead. He left a note saying he had not joined the rebellion, caught between his duty to the emperor and his duty to his service, choosing the oldest way out between imperial will and soldiers' pride. At noon, the emperor's recorded voice went out over the radio, and most of Japan was hearing him speak for the first time in a broadcast that ended the war. Up and did not surrender because its military agreed, but because one man overruled a service that would still rather fight, and even then, only just. The feud had lasted from the Meiji Restoration to the final hours of the war, running through the entire rise and fall of the Japanese Empire as an essential key to understanding the Pacific theater. So could they have won? If the Army and Navy had buried their feud in 1930-9 with unified command, shared intelligence, and joint procurement, could Japan have won the Pacific War? The honest answer is no, as Yamamoto saw clearly in 1940, because the math of total war is brutal and unforgiving, and American industrial capacity was about 10 times Japan's. Once the United States fully mobilized, with Willow Run producing a bomber every hour and Kaiser shipyards launching Liberty ships weekly, no version of this war could Japan match the output. Not with one military, and not with two, but the numbers are not the whole story, as the feud did not make Japan lose, but made Japan lose faster and more wastefully. The feud made Guadalcanal a graveyard where out of every 3 Japanese dead died of starvation and disease, because the Army and the Navy could not coordinate a supply system. The feud made pilots fly aircraft with non-interchangeable parts, and shipyards build 2 types of escort vessels that could not share components, determining how Japan reached its defeat. The feud did not determine the outcome of the war, but it determined how Japan reached that outcome more slowly, more painfully, and more unnecessarily than it needed to be. A divided nation, even with the most elite military and the bravest soldiers, will ultimately be consumed by its own internal friction, as the Japanese Army and Navy proved over 80 years. When the enemy within is harder to defeat than the enemy without, failure is no longer a possibility, but an inevitability, and this is the lesson that echoes through history. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for weekly deep dives into the stories they did not teach you. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield where we uncover the truth behind the myths that shaped our world.